Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau coming for Joe Rogan. Last month, Canada's federal broadcast regulatory agency announced a new mandate requiring online streaming services, including podcast platforms, to register with the government by November 28th. The order applies to streamers generating $10 million or more from the consumers of their content through their platforms.
Independent creators are worried that their online success will now depend on the degree to which their content is deemed Canadian by the government, according to reporting from essayist Rav Arora, who writes that the new mandate could mean Canadians will no longer be able to access certain popular Spotify podcasts. Podcast giant Joe Rogan reacted to Trudeau's new podcast regulation plan and Canada's recent government policies as a whole. Let's watch.
They then want them to hand over information about their content and the people listening to their oh my God. to the government.
Imagine
Trudeau.
getting a hold of Alex Jones's email list. Not just the truckers, but people who donated to the truckers got their bank accounts closed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that is wild.
Yeah.
You got locked out of all of your money because you donated to a cause where you didn't think that people should have to take an experimental vaccine in order to be able to work to drive a truck.
But
really?
Yeah.
Really? You think that's okay? Like, that's so not okay. The fact that those people aren't up in arms. The whole country didn't freak out and demand a change. Like, you can't have, that's dictatorship stuff. That's
Right.
what that is. It's banana republic stuff.
Essayist and co-author of The Illusion of Consensus Substack, Rav Arora, joins us now to weigh in on what the new rules might mean for Canadian content creators. Great to have you with us.
Hey guys, great to be here.
So tell us more about what exactly is being proposed. You know, this sounds very concerning given, not given specifically what Justin Trudeau's government has done in terms of free expression. But frankly, even if the government had a sterling record on this subject, I would be very worried about having any kind of, licensing regime for content creators vis-a-vis any government.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that on the surface, there doesn't seem to be something directly concerning. I mean, it was designed to be a policy to help and uplift and amplify Canadian content creators, specifically Indigenous content creators and content creators of minority backgrounds. And so they've said they want podcast platforms like Spotify and I assume places like Rumble to register with them so that they can follow these mandated guidelines that would help uplift and promote Canadian content creators. But the problem is the parameters for what is Canadian and what gets decided as Canadian enough is kind of ambiguous. And we know that this government in the past, like the CRTC in particular, the federal regulator for podcast platforms, this is what they want to do. They, in the past, have demonstrated a fairly censorious record, such as a couple of years ago when one radio program was talking about a case of a professor in Quebec who was under fire for mentioning the N-word, which was in the title of a book. And they were talking about the case, and they just mentioned the word in an explicitly non-racist way, but they were just talking about the story, and they mentioned the N-word multiple times. And then the CRTC, the federal regulator, forced CBC, which is the CBC television and radio broadcast platform for all of Canada, which has this specific radio program, which had these hosts mention the N-word, to apologize and to show some evidence that they are going to do things differently and that they're going to take some serious measures to correct this problem. And so whatever your personal view on the N-word is, whether you think that you should be able to say it in a non-racist way or you should never be able to say it in any context, it doesn't matter. The problem here is that the CRTC forced the CBC to issue an apology. So the question is, how are they going to do this in the future? Are certain podcasts that violate specific policies or parameters of medical misinformation, for example, which is something that potentially, my own podcast with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, which I am a sole proprietor of here in Canada, we cover COVID issues and a lot of the mixed consensus and misinformation surrounding vaccines, masks, and various public health mandates. Could that be then violative of what the Trudeau government considers accurate information on those topics? That's the question, because clearly in the past, they have erred on a very specific side, therefore, in my opinion, stifling free speech.
I hope you can speak a little bit more to what the bill actually says, because honestly, I'm reading about it, and it's confusing. It seems to have a lot of different prongs and maybe operates in different ways. One description, I'm reading from the CBC, says it requires streaming services such as Netflix and Spotify to pay to support Canadian media content like music and TV shows. So that's what you're talking about trying to facilitate, uplift, boost Canadian content when you were talking about Indigenous content and the like?
Yes, yeah. That seems to be part of it, although there's a lot of vagueness and confusion around how exactly this is going to be imposed.
Right.
And we have at least a little bit of history from the past few months when Bill C-18 was passed. And I don't know if you guys covered it on the show, but basically all Canadian users, including myself right now, cannot access media sources on Instagram. And I think the Hill is included in that, actually. Yeah. So if I go on Instagram, if I go on the Hill's Instagram account, I can't look at any of your posts because Bill C-18 mandated places like Instagram and Facebook to impose this like 4% tax fee, essentially, in that they would have to give back a certain amount to Canadian media outlets as a way to compensate them for their work. And Instagram and Meta, they said, well, we're already providing you a platform where, because of us, you're generating how many millions of dollars for airing your content here. So we're not going to, further compensate you guys for a service that we're giving you. And so the result of that is that Instagram and Meta failed to comply and refused to comply with this mandate. So what's happened here is now, because the government mandated them to compensate and they haven't, now Canadians can access various media sources on Instagram and Meta. So the concern now here with podcasting is if Spotify and Rumble and other places refuse to comply with this federal Canadian mandate, what is that going to mean for the future of accessibility for various podcasts?
But what does compliance look like? I'm just trying to understand, because I do think the enforcement aspect of it might help me to understand how this would even be implemented in the first place. Take this with a grain of salt, of course, but I'm looking at the Canadian Radio, Television and Communications Commission's kind of true or false fact check sheet about this issue. And they're claiming that they will only regulate broadcasters, not content creators and digital creators, but traditional broadcasting services and online streaming services. What do you say of that? Say to that, rather.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting analogy that's been made before is like, if you say, like the difference between saying I want to regulate a library versus I want to regulate the actual books. So here, it's like they want to impose a certain mandate on the library to, prioritize and amplify and preferentially boost certain kinds of content and not others. And they specifically said in the CRTC, they follow the Broadcasting Act, which says that you have to have content that reflects the racial, gender, and sexual diversity and uplifts, minority voices of marginalized backgrounds in Canada. And as I outlined in my piece, that's that's very confusing, and that's a very slippery slope because minority groups across Canada have very differing views on a whole range of topics, and it's not. There's this kind of leftist, in my view, this kind of progressive myth that, BIPOC, LGBTQ plus people, like they're all sort of unified on certain views when in actuality, they're not. Like we had protests across Canada here recently in opposition to SOGI, which is, teaching kids about gender ideology and about changing their gender, et cetera. And you had large groups of Muslim parents protesting against this and saying that they find this curriculum promoting radical gender ideology as Islamophobic. So it's like, what's considered uplifting minority content? Is their content going to be uplifted? The content of Muslim creators who want to oppose this stuff, et cetera? This raises all sorts of questions for how they're going to enforce these mandates of promoting, a diversity of voices, promoting different minority voices when there's so much ambiguity on what's going to be labeled as minority and sufficiently Canadian enough for the government to mandate places like Spotify and Rumble to preferentially boost certain creators over others.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the in the U.S. the various film subsidies in the states, efforts to establish filmmaking industries in the states, which were the incentive subsidy packages would just tax money directly being given to film industries to headquarter in various states, but then snuck in there sometimes are provisions that the movie in question has to make that state look good. That's kind of what came to mind as you were describing this. Rav Arora, thank you so much for joining us and elucidating us on what's going on in Canada. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Tomorrow on Rising, Jessica Burbank and Spencer Brown will take the reins for Rising Fridays.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who prefer to listen while you're on the move, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.